PlexTrack is the platform that helps cybersecurity practitioners get the daily work done. Red teams can create reports in half the time and track risk to resolution with the blue team. Teams can centralize remediation efforts across all scans, assessments, and audits. Effectively communicate risk in real time through simple visualizations, scanner and ticketing integrations, and robust analytics. PlexTrack is perfect for collaboration across all teams. Visit securityweekly.com/PlexTrack to claim your free month. Hackers attack systems that are not patched. You need protection, but virtual patching isn't working. That's why you go patchless. Topia analyzes, prioritizes, and remediates vulnerabilities before they're exploited. Even the 0 days, all from one interface. Security gets better memory defense to complement endpoint strategy while improving overall vulnerability management and compliance. Adopt a hacker's mindset, eliminate vulnerability. Get your 30-day free trial at securityweekly.com/vicarious. Are you an enterprise dissatisfied with overpriced analytics software that can't keep up with modern data? If so, then GravWell is the solution for you. GravWell is an unstructured data analytics platform for enterprises who demand total data visibility across their network. GravWell lets your security team go beyond the SIM and fuse data sources to correlate and answer questions you didn't know needed to be asked. Go to gravwell.io/securityweekly for an unlimited data trial and gain uncompromising visibility today. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you'd like us to cover on one of the upcoming shows? Well, we've got the sheet ready for that guest. Submit your guest suggestions by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and complete the form. We will review those suggestions monthly and reach out once they are reviewed. I was, of course, joking about the sheet. It was just the way I was reading the teleprompter. This segment is sponsored by Edgewise. Visit securityweekly.com/Edgewise to learn more. Joining us for this segment, Harry Sverdlove, the chief technologist at Zscaler. Harry joins us tonight for a segment on the topic, which is very timely. I'm told there was a Solarwinds breach. Securing the enterprise software supply chain. Harry, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Paul. Glad to be here, and I guess a little clarification. Formerly Edgewise, now part of the Zscaler family.
Did I read that as, and maybe that was Burgundy reads what's on the teleprompter. So
it was the slide up there. I mean, you read it right.
I gotcha. Yes, now Zscaler. It's still doing the same feature set in product, right? Moved to Zscaler.
Yes,
correct,
but it's important. It has a new acronym, so everything needs new TLAs. So it's actually Zscaler Workload Segmentation,
gotcha.
ZWS. But it is still the same functionality, same business, same product.
Awesome, outstanding. Harry, you and I were talking about this the SolarWinds breach. I had not read up on it very much when we were talking, but it was clear it was a supply chain attack was involved. There's lots of aspects to this story, but you and I started to focus on like supply chain attacks are a thing. And Tyler was just saying before the show, I'm like, NotPetya relied on one, right? But
NotPetya relied on Medocs. The tax software.
Yep.
That was a supply chain attack. Flame wasn't a supply chain, but it relied on it. Well, at least it used a vulnerability in the Microsoft Update service. So it wasn't attacking Microsoft, but it did attack a flaw in their update server. So there's been a couple supply chain attacks that have been some pretty high profile.
And some of the articles I read said that these are very complicated and sophisticated attacks. That's not always the case when we talk about supply chain, right?
No, it's I think we get confused with sophisticated attackers versus sophisticated attacks.
Yeah.
A lot of these attacks are, if you will, or at least involve the original infiltrations as low tech, I don't think the details are released, for example, in SolarWinds, exactly how their update server got compromised. But I did read that a year ago, it was, a white hat hacker had reported that he could access the update server with the password SolarWinds123. That's not very sophisticated. But the subsequent stages and staying stealth like they did, those techniques I think were sophisticated. But I think in most cases, when we say it's an advanced or sophisticated attack, we really mean the attacker more than the techniques. And
I also think we have to reference the different groups that may have been involved in this attack. I think we tend to lose sight of, especially when you read the media, news articles on this subject, that there may be different levels of sophistication associated with various groups. And one group may go, I've got the SolarWinds update servers, like, you want access, you pay me some money. They give it to maybe in a more or less sophisticated group that then gains a foothold and maybe sells off that access to someone else. It's at a different level of sophistication, right? This isn't all just 0 or 1 kind of thing.
Well, and that's true, but that's even true with even when the actor is just state-sponsored. And we've seen this a lot with Chinese state-sponsored attacks where there are different teams, sort of their A team, their B team, their C team, and their outsourced team, just like any other company. And so they might do an infiltration with their high-tech team or, the A team, and then pass it off to, hey, we got we've got 10,000 systems compromised. Let's hand it off to the B team to grab the passwords. Or might be the opposite. The B team found their way in. Let's hand it off to the A team because this is a high-value target. So there's no question that even within, if you will, attacker campaigns, there's different teams with different levels of sophistication, just like at a company, any other company.
Right. I can just imagine the conversation in Russian where they're like, yeah, we've been in this company for so long. I won't even try a Russian accent. We've been in this company so long. We got what we needed. Like, let's hand it off to the newer teams and just see what they do with it, right? And then maybe they can learn something. And if they burn all of our stuff, like, whatever, we were going to burn it anyway, right?
Well, you have to also look at it from that other team. They're probably thinking, hey, this is my chance to move up into the A team.
Right.
If I show my boss I'm doing really well. Now, of course, I won't try to feign a Russian accent, but I can give you my one Russian. I can say, "Я не знаю ничего." It means I don't know anything.
I thought you were going to say that I am the machine is what that means.
I am the machine. That's the best skit ever. And not enough people get that reference.
Right.
Oh my gosh, that is such a great skit.
We digress. That's awesome. But so we were talking about in the context of also, and pen testers, former pen testers in the room. Was it Seagate's backup exec? Is that who owned backup exec? I feel like it transferred around a little bit, but it was Seagate backup exec, right? And that agent, they had a massive footprint in the enterprise. And it was a glorious day when you got on the internal network and you're like, sweet. They're running backup exec. That means at least like a certain percentage, even if they'd updated, there was always that like small percentage, sometimes, usually a large percentage, that were vulnerable to some heinous remote code execution that was ridiculously easy.
Yeah. No, this wasn't a supply chain one, but I remember, gosh, what was it? In the early days of Sony, their DRM that they'd install on surreptitiously install on systems, and they wanted to hide their own DRM. So basically, it would hide any file in Windows system that matched a very specific file name. So it wasn't a supply chain, but attackers realized, hey, all I have to do is name my file this, put it in the system directory, and if they've got this Sony DRM CD, they'll never see me. Right.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if attacks such as these that are going after the software update mechanism, I'm wondering if that's largely because while email phishing is wildly successful, it's still kind of noisy. In other words, I can really slip in unnoticed if I can compromise an update server, although it's not as much of a targeted attack necessarily.
Well, if you can take, and this is one of the challenges when we talk about supply chain attacks, everybody out there with their software now in the World Wide Web, they have update servers, they automatically push out updates, and they think to themselves, I'm going to set out this update server, make it accessible to the entire internet because I want all my clients to be able to get it. And I'm only putting good stuff there anyway, so it's okay. And they don't think about that as a security vector. It's a nasty problem. And if you're going to have an update server, which most people are going to have one, you have to look at that from a threat vector perspective. And I've seen this with, we see this is obviously the entry point for the Orion compromise, but we've seen similar problems with digital phone systems, with other things where they don't think about they think, is my product secure, or I'm testing it, or I'm going through my SDLC. But what happens at the final stage when it goes out there? Can anybody get on the update server? Yep. Can anybody push something out?
Harry, you reminded me, Microsoft suffered from this attack, and likely one reason why the largest software company in the world can go, hey, we can fix this attack. We've got the talent and the people and the means to do it. And largely they have done a fantastic job, except for that one time.
Yeah, but actually, and they've helped out here. I think Microsoft has taken over at least one, if not a multiple, of the SolarWinds command and control domains. So, and they're working with government agencies, I assume, to at least try to halt the infection, if not trigger a kill switch and identify who may be impacted.
Right.
So, I had a question. We talked about, easily accessing their update source. Why would I think they only got the one that's been identified? Why wouldn't I think they've got all of them? Because wouldn't they do equally bad security everywhere? Or am I just being tinfoil hat?
You mean SolarWinds update server?
Yeah. Why wouldn't I assume they got all their products?
The way that their one works is very specific, and this is something that we do a lot from like a red team standpoint, right? The sideloading of DLLs and using that signed binary. This is basically that technique. Now, the fact that they did it to a build server, knowing that certain companies are going to pull those updates, that's where it gets kind of interesting. Like, is all of this smoke and mirrors, and there's a back campaign going with different infrastructure, or was this highly targeted? Because there was a very interesting sequence of events that unfolded in a single week with some very high value targets as this was coming out. And so I still think there's some smoke and mirrors there, but there's also some very organized and objective frame of mind people attacking these. Like, this has some serious implications. It was well organized and hit very fast and hard.
Yeah, no, there's no question about that. And I think you're spot on. There is a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Could other things have been affected? If they did get control or were able to infiltrate one build server, would they have done more? But the other side of the coin is SolarWinds was just a stepping stone for them. They obviously had a set of targets, or a multiple set of targets, and by attacking the supply chain, they aren't interested necessarily in what SolarWinds has. They're interested in SolarWinds customers. So is it possible it is simply the Orion software that was infected? Yes. Is it possible that SolarWinds needs to do a deep cleanse of, or at least a review of everything and all of their systems? Absolutely.
Yep. And Harry, this becomes an interesting...
Sorry,
Sorry,
Larry, then Tyler.
Yeah, so Harry, this one becomes an interesting one when we start looking into the SolarWinds stuff and who allegedly was compromised based on those randomly generated URLs in the AVS cloud domain, and reversing those hashes. There are two companies that are now coming out to say that one has said just recently, within the last couple hours, has said that they may have been compromised by it. And another one whose domain shows up there. And we now may be looking into a supply chain attack that led to an attack for another organization to allow for additional supply chain attacks. And those two companies are Microsoft and Cisco.
I think we're going to hear a lot of layers of the onion are going to get peeled over the next several months. In fact,
I just Harry, I can't wait till the book comes out, because I got a feeling this is big enough to warrant a book that I love reading.
It's time for another movie. Look, since Hackers in the 80s, we need something new now. Not to make light of the situation.
Oh God, he had to go there.
I know, you had to mention the best hacker movie in the world.
But you said 80s. Hackers came out in 95. What year?
95. 25-year anniversary.
War Games was 83. Sneakers was 92. Hackers was 95.
And back to Tyler.
I stand absolutely corrected. You're right. Would you like to play a game?
Tyler, I think Tyler would. Tyler.
I think one thing we're going to have to kind of be cognizant of and think about moving forward is SolarWinds was a stepping stone, and there's a very clear campaign and objective here that is being executed very efficiently. So what other software vendors, like, are you one of the other vendors, or for other actors, this should be a wake-up call to a lot of the software vendors, like, get your stuff in order, because say something like, I don't know, one of the VPN services or a remote desktop service, BombGuard, any of these services that are widespread inside of enterprises that provide some, interesting access, they've always been targets, but this is just a proof that, hey, these targets are going to be leveraged, and when that happens, it's going to happen quickly, and it's going to be pretty devastating if you're not prepared for good remediation, good IR response, have a good disaster plan. Like, all of those things are going to come into play for SolarWinds, and you've seen how bad this could be a devastating blow to a company.
But Tyler, what you're also alluding to is, as an enterprise, what do we trust? Who do we trust? Do we obviously a lot of people, right?
I think that's part of that.
I was throwing you a softball there, Harry.
No, I think that's exactly right. Because look, you're both right. Obviously, all software vendors need to look at their own practices, their own SDLC, their own infrastructure, and not only consider their own security situation, but what is their incident response plan. That said, at the end of the day, I'm not a big fan of throwing other companies under the bus type of thing. Everybody gets hacked. It happens, sophisticated, not sophisticated. It's going to happen. And so the question is, what do consumers, what is the customers, how should they be planning? How do you bring in new technology? How do you bring in, it's the same as, look, it is not a different problem than when you're hiring third-party contractors and third-party vendors and you're bringing them into your buildings and they have temporary access badges and they're walking around freely. How do you secure your property but still allow third parties? This is a little more complicated because this is the digital world. How do you bring in third party technologies? And they are ubiquitous and you can't live without them. So how do we bring those in and yet still keep them isolated from anything that they don't need to do their job? And I think that really is sort of, this is obviously where Zscaler and why the Edgewise and Zscaler marriage makes so much sense. That is the zero trust model, which is you assume everybody is breached. You assume every person is potentially infected. You assume every system. You assume every third-party tech is potentially breached or at least breached. How do you deploy that now? How do you deploy that in your organization?
Back in the old school days of Unix and to a certain extent Linux, we used to run processes in cheroot jails because we didn't trust the process. We wanted to limit its access. And how do you do that when you've got something like Solarwinds or Backup Exec or some kind of agent, let's say on a Windows system that you're trying to trust? I think other than certain products such as yours, Harry, right? We struggle to get there, right?
Right. No, sales pitch aside, obviously that is what Zscaler workload segmentation is about, is helping do that. But when you're dealing with software that, like backup software, that by definition is going to have access to every system, every file, even protected files, because that's its job. How do you make sure, in that case, what kind of requirements do you place on your vendors to make sure that at least they've thought through the problem? I mean, step one is first find out, have they even thought through the problem? Do they have a plan? Do they have a security posture? Do they have, whether it's accreditation or other types of things, that at least show? I'm not saying that any accreditations give you the kiss of safety. I'm saying it at least shows your thinking. That's a starting question. And have that conversation with your vendors, because again, when you can't deploy a backup software and say, but it can't access any of my systems. You can't deploy a SolarWinds Orion and say, I want to monitor my network performance and reroute and infrastructure improvements, but actually don't access my network. But
that's a great point. And we've covered a lot of third-party vendor risk, right? But in this context, I find it very interesting that there's a scale that we can start weeding out maybe some potential vendors. If they have not considered security and can't answer basic questions, that's different. I'm not saying you don't choose that software, right? It's one part of the criteria. And then there's other vendors that really have thought about it. And there's a way to measure that and, survey that. And that's one thing. But the other thing that I like is, I think, to get all of us collectively to a higher degree of security, we need to be able to scrutinize each other and say, well, if I'm going to partner with you, or I'm going to buy your technology or use your services, I need to see some type of security report, activity, survey, compliance, whatever it might be, before we can do business. And the companies that don't have that are going to go, oh, we really need that, right? I really think that every company has kind of this point where they've taken security somewhat seriously enough, up until a point where you're not going to grow as a business or get new customers until you're forced to have that security. And it's not the best answer, but I think that helps.
And having been in companies in all sizes and stages, it's obviously always a challenge. When you're a startup, if you don't have functionality, you don't have customers.
Right.
You need to have customers first, but then, so you're not thinking security, although you should be. And then it always ends up becoming this afterthought in a lot of startup companies. And then all of a sudden they get too big, and in many cases it might be too late. They need to have that conversation even starting, but it's a tough challenge, right? If you're trying to build something new for the world, improve something, and you have to be thinking at the same time about the things that aren't going to gain you any revenue, which is, what about if somebody compromises it? What are the threat vectors of what I'm offering?
Absolutely.
I think getting the business units though to buy into that, like security has traditionally been its own department. It's got its own budget, and everything security related has to come out of that budget. If you get the buy-in though, and start to think of this as a whole business, where each business unit is affected by security, so that buy-in needs to be dispersed across larger asset groups or larger groups, so that everybody is participating, everybody's budgets reflect, and that kind of team mindset from the business down all correlates and is supported. The siloed security group and the siloed business unit of security, that model is not working as well.
Agreed.
It isn't, but not to be yet. Unfortunately, it's a little bit Pollyannish, because the reality is, I've seen that work. I've seen what you suggest work, and I'll tell you when I've seen it work. After a company has been breached, after they've been hit, and they're looking at an existential event, everybody's bought in. They believe it. They feel it. They now know to their core, this is important to the business. Until that happens, convincing people that security is important to their business is kind of like convincing people, don't eat the Oreo cookies. You really should just be eating, broccoli and healthy stuff.
The Russians would have had a much richer threat landscape if you buy into what Harry and Tyler just said, had they kept this quiet. Because now there's all these companies that have breaches, and based on what you two just said, their security is going to get way better.
The reality is they didn't.
Target,
the attackers did try to keep it quiet. Right.
Yeah.
This was a very, that's part of what made this sophisticated. Each attack, and FireEye has said as such, that they believe each target was manually controlled and had an attack plan specific tailored to that target. They kept it low. They kept the binary small. Even the command and control, most attacks you see with command and control, once they establish command and control, they encrypt the channel. They don't care. It's, they figure they could talk all day long. This obfuscated it using steganography and the commands embedded in standard looking XML files. They did everything they could to stay below the radar. And this came out only if I've put back this timeline, it was just first FireEye came out and said, hey, somebody has breached and taken some of our pen testing tools and our red team tools. And then very shortly thereafterwards, you see what the second stage of that, or the purpose of that was.
They got some cojones picking FireEye as a target, though.
Yeah, you've got to say that's right. You're taking the number one IR incident response team, at least certainly in notoriety around the world, and picking on them. That takes very big cojones.
Yep, Jeff.
But you know what? I'm depressed, because if it weren't for FireEye picking up on this activity, all the security technology that's out there today, all the compliance standards, regulatory standards, everything was missing it. Stop and think about that for a minute.
Yeah, I was kind of like, no, Jeff can't be depressed. Now I'm like, nope, I'm kind of depressed too.
Don't be sad.
Well, also FireEye caught it. It sounded more like a process internal to FireEye that was responsible as kind of the first indicator.
Yeah,
in an article
they caught some new device on the VPN, that was in a weird place that they had enrolled in multi-factor. The other one that's also terrifying is you think about FireEye, quote, the world's largest incident responder, as it were. They're a great way to gain intelligence as to whether or not you've been caught by determining what IR gigs that they're doing.
Yeah, juice is worth the squeeze.
Right.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Well, the other lesson here, and we knew this too, though, is the tools that the defenders use are the same tools that the attackers use. NotPetya, which had a variant of Mimikatz in it. Mimikatz was developed as a security pen testing sort of exercise.
And the Russians, if you remember the story of Mimikatz, the Russians were very interested in Mimikatz even before it was open sourced.
Yeah. And here again, the tools that were taken from FireEye. These are tools used for defensive purposes, but absolutely can be turned around and used for offensive. And I think this is also why, Paul, when you were talking earlier about attacks could be in multiple stages and handed off, I'd look at it even another way. Attacks, the types of sophistication, when we are actually talking about sophisticated attacks, and there are pieces that are, that might be developed by the NSA, or vulnerabilities that might be developed by the NSA or by Russia or by the Chinese. Once those get out there, they trickle downstream. Those tools, those techniques, they become taxed and used by cybercrime. Right? Eternal Blue wasn't discovered and held onto so that ransomware attacks could be so prevalent. The cyber criminals got a hold of it, and then they used it for this. Same thing with most of these, and the techniques that we might see here. What are we going to do? The security research teams, we're publishing indicators. We're going to publish a lot more. I'm sure a lot more is going to be dissected about the Orion compromise, and the binaries are going to be published, and the details are going to be published, and then they're going to get sold on the dark web and commercialized, and then it becomes, and then the cyber criminals will use them.
Harry, do you think was that to kind of level the playing fields, to kind of hurt the enemy being FireEye has these tools? If we compromise FireEye, maybe we've got some other objectives. But oh, by the way, don't forget, before we leave, make sure you take FireEye's tools that they developed and exploits and take those so we can make them public so they don't have them in their arsenal anymore.
Good question. I do go, but I can't speak to their motivation on why they targeted FireEye.
Right.
It could also be, as I understand it, they compromised FireEye through Orion, through the same SolarWinds hack, and it may be that, if I understand this correct, and I could be wrong, that if that's the timeline, it may be that, so there they were, they had compromised Orion, thinking, okay, we've got access now to a bunch of government agencies, commercial agencies they can pick. And one day one of the Russian hackers or whoever it might be came into work and said, holy crap, we're on FireEye's network.
Yeah.
And then in other words, it wasn't necessarily, hey, let's go get FireEye because we have an intention. It might have been opportunistic. In that case, I don't know.
You mentioned NSA, and I was going to save some of my NSA discussion for the news segment, but it seems like we're just talking about it now. We talked about this several weeks before. I forget what episode, Paul, but we were talking about cryptography and encryption. Well, I know I've brought it up before that, one of the principles when NSA was in the business of building encrypting cipher systems was to assume full knowledge of those systems was compromised. So if they were building a little black box that was going to do encryption, it was assumed that the adversary, who was primarily the Soviet Union back in those days, had gotten a copy, had gotten the specs, got the user's manual, they reverse engineered it, broken down, they knew everything about it, assume all that, make it secure. And, in the commercial world, largely these days, when it comes to crypto and keeping things secure, there's a lot of proprietary solutions, and companies don't want to talk about what they're doing to keep things secure. And usually, in my experience, it's because they're not doing a whole lot or they don't believe in what they're doing. But the ones that are even taking it seriously and trying to do things creatively and securely, they still don't like to talk about it. I keep chuckling, and this is not a laughing matter, but I keep thinking, what is happening right now is it's just good old-fashioned espionage like back in the Cold War days, where one side figures out a way to be devastatingly effective against the other side, and oops, all of a sudden it's discovered. Only this time it's in the cyber world, it's in the digital world, and it's hugely public, and everybody's talking about it. But events like this have happened in our nation's past from a national security perspective. I just can't talk about most of them because they're classified. But it reminded me, and what I wanted to bring up, Paul, in the news segment is, and I know we were talking about this a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was a couple months ago, the IBM Selectra 2 typewriters and the way the Russians had built the listening device into the bar, the roller bar. It's that type of thing.
Mhm.
Devastating until it gets discovered, and then you're like, oh my gosh, they're everywhere.
I don't disagree. Look, Dick Clark, who used to be on
Mhm.
the board of one of my earlier companies, used to say espionage is the second oldest profession.
Hmm.
And what you said is totally true. But the difference is that if I'm sitting there listening to a typewriter, or what do they call that thing? You were saying that the keyboard part. I've got one document
Right.
or one
Mhm.
user. With cyber espionage, you've got 1 million users or 1 billion documents. The concept is absolutely old as the sun, but the damage that can be done in the breadth is that is the world we live in today, and that's different than ever before.
Yes, in terms of scale, it's different. The other spin or twist that I'm thinking of is just in terms of so much of our industry that's doing over the last 25 years that has done the various FUD sales and marketing campaigns, and it is gleeful in one sense when something bad happens because everybody can point to it. I mean, at scale, that's why we have names of vulnerabilities and logos and things like that. But for the most part, in the commercial world, in the private sector, the adversaries that we've been worrying about have been largely, going after things for financial gain. It's just, how do we make money? How do we make money? The fact that now we've got this espionage thing, it's like, oh yeah, threat actors, in the old days, they were doing it for political
Right.
motivations. And all of a sudden that's come crashing into to everything. And like you said, the scale is immense.
Right. And this is
and we're largely unequipped in the private sector to handle. You're using the term sophisticated. I use deliberate, orchestrated, directed attacks against specific companies. Most companies in the private sector are not equipped to handle that type of attention, shall we say?
No. Well, then, and I've often thought, and I've been on panels we've talked about, should the government be the one responsible for responding to these kinds of attacks?
Right.
We're on the front lines, right? You're an enterprise customer, you're an enterprise employee, and you're on the front lines being attacked, but you can't possibly have the means, wherewithal, insight to respond. At least with financial, you can understand it. You can look at your own assets and say, hey, this has value. My credit cards have value because they're financial. My social security numbers have value because of fake credit or what have you, or identity theft. But we're not well suited, certainly as private citizens, to understand, well, what has value from a state perspective? What has value as information? To us, it doesn't seem like we could do much with it. But when you're a nation state, what can you do in terms of bribery, in terms of influence, in terms of so many other things that they can do with information, that I do think we need to rethink what we consider to be high value and sensitive. And I also do think it is the type of task, at least in response, that elevates to the nations, to the state. We're not going to be able to defend ourselves. And I say that as a private citizen, not as a cybersecurity expert, but private citizens are not going to be able to defend themselves against attacks like this.
It's an interesting debate, right, Howard? I think it was Dick Clark's book that really called that out and gave some backstory to, Jeff, your reference in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The analogy is, should a company here in the U.S. have to defend themselves against a nuclear missile attack? Or is that left to the government? Now we fast forward to today with cyber attacks, and it's a very similar thing, alluding to what Harry's saying. Now that nation states may be going after, let's say, U.S. companies, is it a similar, different, or where does it fall between the nuclear missile threat and the cyber threat?
Yeah.
Well, in the old days,
really hard
we called it
to address.
It is a hard problem to address. In the old days, we called it national defense. Now it's national security.
Mm-hmm.
I was on a virtual happy hour last night with a lot of very connected and very senior people, currently and retired, that do the national defense type of stuff. I won't say who a lot of them are because we're under. I can never think of the what house rules?
Friendier? No.
No, Chatham House.
Chatham House rule. But like one of the people that was on the call last night is the CISO for a major pharmaceutical. If I said the name, you'd know immediately who the pharmaceutical was. And they were talking about all the attacks that they've been under since the beginning of the pandemic, and the steps that they've taken, and the orchestrated attacks that they've seen, and the monumental efforts and the exhausting efforts that they've been taking to protect, their environment, their network, because of all the COVID vaccine research and so on and so forth. And I was sitting there listening to them talk. I said, I mean, they were doing national security, national defense type of efforts to protect this one particular company, and I'm like, that so doesn't translate to 99% of the companies that are out there. And what we're saying essentially is nobody can afford it. I mean, the amount that it would cost to mount that type of defense against all the different things, it's just not feasible. That's why we're vulnerable. That's why this stuff's going to continue to happen.
And I believe a number of these, the research didn't just happen at the large pharmaceuticals, but at the smaller ones. We were talking about, all companies when they start up, they need to get buy-in at all levels. Well, if you're a tiny company and it is expensive to get to do biomedical research and vaccine research, and you have a small limited time and budget and resources, and of course expertise, say in epidemiology or genealogy, or not genealogy, but genes.
You had epidemiology, yes,
and genealogy. Maybe your family tree. You really, where would you even possibly have the bandwidth time to defend against a nation state stealing that research from you?
One of the things, though, we're going to have to consider is, all these IOCs are now coming out. And the attacks, the nation state level attacks, those are going to be probably very specific supply chain attacks. They're going to be very specific companies that are targeted as part of an objective. The criminal syndicates or, the underground hacking scene, whatever it is, once some of these techniques come out or the tools are released, that's where you're going to start seeing different motivations. Ransomware, we've seen it with, Eternal Blue, where it's picked up. Ransomware is now integrating new techniques and technologies. So this is kind of a long-term problem. But just simply being able to defend against all the IOCs and check your network, that's like one small piece. We really have to get back to the fundamentals, because most attackers are going to change this code. They're going to modify it for themselves. They're going to utilize it differently against different infrastructure. So making sure that we're not an IOC or signature-based security, and we're moving more towards the behavior. Like, do we have the capability to stop nation states because we are properly defense in depth layered? Those are the things that we have to keep reminding people. You're not going to defend against nation states, but that's probably not who's going to target you next. It's going to be the criminal people that now have access to different tool sets and know different vulnerabilities that are now going to be exploited.
One of my concerns is that the reason that supply chain attacks such as this are so effective is that because it's difficult to simulate in things like a pen test. Because I can hire Tyler or Larry or any of my friends to do a pen test, and I can't tell them, look, we use these vendors, and what I want you to do is I want you to break into those vendors, and I want you to corrupt their supply chain. I want you to simulate that attack. It's probably not going to fly.
This is why Assume Breach is and Purple Team is such a great model to follow, because you have to take that those very specific goals and different starting points. Some people just drop a box on a network and say pen tests are internal. That's not technically a good assumed breach. Starting from very specific threat modeling of what your assumed breach might come in and look like if someone were to gain the FTP account or own the web server with this specific service that has some specific access, what can you do from there? Or if the receptionist is phished, or what about accounting? If we start in accounting and HR, does that change our path or what our objectives look like? And what do you have in place to detect that? If we're not trying to get DA or own Active Directory or do all the pen testy things, but our specific objective is to make an unseen database modification to do an ACH transfer, that is an objective that's going to have a very specific goal and starting point and a different outcome from the end point.
What's interesting, Tyler, I want to start the test. I want to restart my test with you or Larry, any of my friends. I want to say, look, we're using SolarWinds Orion. I'm going to give you admin credentials to that. And that's the only thing I'm going to give you. Go.
Right.
It could be interesting.
But I mean, look,
Yeah,
there's an easier explanation too, aside from obviously the breadth that you could do in a supply chain attack. It's if I attack a supply chain. So instead of having to deal with 20, 30, 2,000 different companies' security postures, some might be better than others. I've basically made it least common denominator.
Yep.
I find the one place, the one technology and I target them. It's not that dissimilar, just at a different scale than, the old technique of water holing. If I can't get you because maybe you're, let's talk phishing. I can't get you because you're too smart. You got your techniques. You've educated your users. So you're wise to me sending you goofy emails with links. I figure out, well, find common websites where all these people go. They can't all be secure. And I compromise one of them.
Yep.
Eventually, I make it up, but you're going to go to CNN.com or whatever the website might be. And that becomes my watering hole. So I've reduced my threshold of what I needed for compromise to whatever my least common denominator is. And now I have access, or at least a starting foothold, into all of these customers instead of dealing with them one at a time.
That's really interesting.
And it is a challenge. And by the way, defending against watering hole attacks is an inordinately complex problem because it's something outside of the
your
company's
control.
purview.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not in charge of the World Wide Web and every website out there. Similarly, you're not in charge of every piece of software you bring in the company. You can have certain standards and you can ask the right questions, and you need to have the dialogue. Right.
Well, it's why I like technologies such as yours, Harry, right? ZWS, you said you renamed it too, which I really like that acronym. But also there's technologies that, in your example of the watering hole, they take the browser outside of the user perspective, right? The browser is living somewhere else, and I'm just getting fed images back maybe from that browser, right? But the browser lives on a disposable container somewhere.
And Zscaler, by the way, we have something that allows you to do that too. But
nice. Oh, awesome! I didn't know that. Actually.
We actually do. And I don't know what the rebranded technology, what the acronym is on it, but it actually allows you to do just that for vendors. So you can have a controlled session with your secure services, and it's literally virtual and disconnected from your own systems.
That was kind of my
that's
question.
one example. And the idea is, how do you do that? Well, if it's your security tool, if it's SolarWinds, if it's your backup software, you obviously can't isolate it the same way you might isolate a browser. And so at some point, you're going to bring in third-party technology that has access. And so at least being able to have the conversation, being able to monitor what is it doing, and being able to profile that. I think, mentioned behavioral analytics. Behavioral analytics, not on the employees, but on the software. Is it doing? Right. Is it all of a sudden acting differently? And then it may or may not be a bad thing. It could be a great update, but you have to have that ongoing conversation with the vendors.
Tyler?
So if that is, I'm just thinking through from a micro-segmentation, zero trust model, and SD-WAN, like call it what you want, and layer 7 firewall. Do you think that when those are well deployed, that kind of next level of defense where we have so many layers, where you're identifying which binary is running, which IP it's allowed to connect to, what data it's allowed to bring across on, during which times, that granularity where zero trust is really trying to get to, would that have stopped pretty much all of the known IOCs that we're looking at here?
SolarWinds, yeah, I actually do believe so. I mean, there are stages that it wouldn't have stopped. Who knows? It wouldn't have stopped the Orion server or their build system getting compromised unless maybe they were running that level of segmentation. But then, how do you stop it when it comes into your organization? The part of the stealthness of SolarWinds is also, or the Orion breach really, is its weakness. The fact that it was so lightweight means it couldn't do that much. Most of what it had to do, then it had to either download additional things and or modify or use software already present. And they had that whole, create, delete, create, exec, delete, recreate, where they would swap out scheduled tasks with a bad binary, but they had to download something different outside of their scope because they were trying to keep their scope very quiet. And those are all opportunities for both detection and prevention. If you are only allowing trusted components in your organization and not newly installed stuff to communicate, or even if it's trusted, you're only more specifically allowing it to communicate with the folks it has communicated with in the past, then any change in that behavior would be stopped. And it wouldn't have stopped the droppers from downloading, but it would have stopped them from moving laterally. It would have stopped them from communicating outward. And that's the whole point of, when you look at kill chains or MITRE's attack sequence, which is if you can stop at least you have stop gaps at multiple stages of their attacks, you're not going to, there's no panacea. You're not going to stop everything possible bad from happening, but you can cause enough damage and disrupt the attack life cycle to effectively nullify it.
Yeah, so they would have, like you said, the dropper, like even any pieces of those stages as they're being done, even having one of those break in some of these, attacks, that breaks essentially the attack. It limits their usefulness so that they're not able to do either the next stage or gain the ultimate objective, and or get usefulness out of whatever they're doing on there. If you had broken the C2 and this application shouldn't be calling out to an unknown domain, it has very specific parameters that are granularly controlled, then that would have been an effective defense in-depth mitigation. If we follow that pattern and we make sure that we have those set up, I think that's where we have to keep moving towards, which is why Zero Trust is one of the few things that does kind of scare me when I'm doing an engagement, because it is very easy from a heuristic standpoint to get picked up, and it's very hard to detect or know where those heuristics are.
Joff has joined us. Joff, you haven't heard, there was a breach of SolarWinds. Did you hear about that?
Yeah, there was just a little bit of press about that. I wasn't quite sure what was going on, but
welcome,
wow.
Joff. Good to have you.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Sorry, Harry, did you have a response?
I was going to say, well, in the SolarWinds case, and I would suggest this for any third party you bring in, it clearly, let's just say, and I don't even know if it was the same component, but let's say it was for the sake of argument, needed to communicate with its update server. If that was the only communication allowed, just like your own employees, if they want to communicate with A, B, and C, they have to make requests for each of those. It shouldn't have been allowed to communicate with anything else, even if it was doing the OIP protocol or masking itself to look like that. When it was deployed, one layer of that mitigation would be if you restricted it to only communicating with that one server, it would have gotten the malicious update, but it wouldn't have gone to the C2 servers. It wouldn't have been able to communicate out to any of the other randomly generated domains because that communication was blocked. And again, it's not a panacea, but this is part of how do you put boundaries around software you bring into your organization? And there are absolutely ways to put them in via communications, via network is the most obvious one, if you will.
It reminds me, I've been preaching micro network segmentation for years. I mean, I started doing this, I started doing this in 2005, and everybody thought I was nuts. They still think I'm nuts, but, hey,
in a good way.
Well, the technology in 2005, you would have been nuts trying to do that through instrumentation of existing firewall tech. But the concept, you were spot on.
I did it by bringing ISP technology into the organization. I was doing multiple layer 3 networks with MPLS.
And Chroot jails.
And Chroot jails.
It's come a long way since then.
And he didn't have any weekends either.
Right. That too.
No, I didn't. I didn't have a life, and nothing has changed. I still don't have a life.
As to the extent of this breach, does the panel have thoughts as like how deep does the rabbit hole go?
Very, very deep.
Thanks.
I mean, are you talking about the rabbit hole of what chained attacks this is going to lead to, or is already leading to,
or like what IP was stolen, or how many companies were affected?
I mean, you look at the list of companies that, whether it was the chicken or the egg, and Orion was the starting point or the next access, and then the red, FireEye. Like, you think about a lot of the U.S. government, we're talking about nation states. They're very targeted. They're very interested in the U.S. government. That's their target. So the chain of events that's already happened, and maybe those customers that don't have the ability to detect, I think we're just starting to unfold this. I think this is going to be much deeper, and there's some interesting. I mean, this is right around after elections. You've got DHS getting hit. You've got U.S. Treasury getting hit. There's either a big objective and a big plan that was worth burning all this at a very specific time, or it was a target of opportunity, which I don't think this nation state works like that.
No, I think it's probably both, right? I mean, because timing-wise, we're in governmental transition. That is the perfect time to target and pull the trigger, because you have an administration that's not on its toes at a transition point in time. It is absolutely, you cannot tell me the timing was somehow incidental.
Although the attacks, as I understand it, go back all the way back to March. So it wasn't. Right. Yes, it was an election year. It's funny because I was going to answer the question when you asked me how deep is the rabbit hole. I was going to answer deep enough that it's going to awaken every conspiracy theorist. Yeah. and I think that's true. Yep. I'm not saying it wasn't timed specifically. I'm just saying I think it goes deep enough that you could pretty much insert conspiracy theory here, and deep enough that we'll never actually really know. We'll know whatever we have observed, but I mean, do we even fully understand the side effects of the OPM data breach? Just a few years back.
That's true.
No, there's
and this
definitely
is
a lot
easily
there
on that scale.
So I vote at the next actual in-person conference that we see each other, that everybody shows up with a tinfoil hat on, just to start off, because hey.
Well, I mean, you got DHS controlling vaccine release lists, and this all started back in March. Again, you can put whatever conspiracy theory in there, but there may be very specific objectives that, we know that pharma's been targeted. We know where vaccines are now being released with that list, and we know that this all happened right during an election and or a vaccine release. So, we're probably never going to get the full picture or extent to what this is. But there's some good inferences that you can kind of start to draw around all of those pieces.
Tyler has the most layers on his tinfoil hat. Yeah, and the best conspiracy theories.
The breadth of the targets was enough such that if you want to go conspiracy theory, I think we are literally scratching the surface. In that, yes, maybe it was for the for the vaccine information. Maybe it was for some secret stealth fighter jet that we don't even know about because it was in one of the alphabet organizations that was targeted. Or maybe it's something completely else, and this was an explosion over there. And while we're looking over there, they're actually doing phase 2 or 3 of the campaign. That's the challenge with it being so broad, is that literally it's not hiding in daylight. It's like everything's on fire, so you don't have to worry about hiding.
Yeah, you wonder how it went down, whether they got caught by accident or they'd gotten what they had intended in the initial. We said it started in March, so they've had all this time this year to go, yep, we got pretty much like we're good. And so now let's try some noisier attacks to get some other stuff. And if we get caught, we get caught. That's kind of my fear, that attackers are running with this assumption that I can have objectives and meet them until such time I reach a point where why would I just stop? I still have access. I might as well just keep going, right?
Well, that could very well be, again, totally nothing to back this up but supposition, but that could be what happened here. Is the FireEye thing was a coincidence, happenstance. They took advantage of it. Yep. And by the way, that's might have been in fact that's what let the genie out of the bottle, and now they got caught. Once you start pulling the thread, the rest of the threads come clean, and they're sitting there burning their house down. The attackers try to clean up the tracks. There was when you go back to NotPetya, which was not ransomware but blowing up. There's still theories going around today that it was an attack, that its purpose wasn't to destroy all the data on these machines, but was to hide what actually happened beforehand.
Right.
And now they're destroying all the evidence. We'll just never know.
Well, so we could, while we're speculating, we could take the countdown to 0 day kind of theory on this, which is, entirely likely when you think about it. And that is, they've been doing this a long time, right? And they finally said, you know what, we've got a period of opportunity here. In government transition, let us push this to the max and just see what happens.
And in the end, let's make the U.S. look bad as much as possible, and that's the end goal, and then we'll move on to something else.
Yeah, if we assume it's only
and if you look at the if you folks, if you haven't read Countdown to Zero Day, please read it.
Oh, love that book.
And if you look at that sequence, on the flip side, it kind of makes sense, right? Nation states are going to act like this. They're going to be very, very good, but then at some point they're going to get very aggressive.
I think this book, Joff, might be called Countdown to Sunrise or something like that.
Yeah, Sunburst.
Sunburst. Countdown to Sunburst. Yeah, I think there's going to be a book about this. I can't wait.
Sunburn.
You want a starring role, I suspect, huh?
I would love even just like a one-line quote. That would make me so.
Paul
that
says.
would make me so happy.
So Paul opens his drawer today and says, "Why is my computer working?"
Right.
The guy that really needs to be a starring role would be Chris Krebs, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
where they're like,
I was telling him, and then they fired me.
Yeah, Trump fired Krebs, so we were like, well, gloves off now. Like, let's just have at it, right?
Wow. Yeah. Now we could say, what is this? The whole SolarWinds attack as a disgruntled employee?
Could be. That could be another theory. See how you're getting the hang of this. Like on podcasts, we don't have to have evidence.
Conspiracies are fun.
We can just speculate. That's what we do. We speculate.
No, listen, you didn't see me. I've heard the threads where they tie SolarWinds to Dominion voting systems, even though they weren't using Orion. But we could go crazy here.
I do not think it was tied to the election. Everything I've seen, right? You just kind of back me up on that.
I actually don't either, but it's outside my pay grade.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we can't say anything definitively, again, which is why we have a podcast where we can speculate. And it's been fun speculating. Harry, closing thoughts, updates from the Zscaler front, or anything else you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So this is one of the worst attacks we've seen, but it's not going to be the last. We're going to see more, and they're going to. And then, as I say, even though espionage has been around forever, the scale that now they can operate is huge, and it is going to take lots of layers. I think supply chain attacks will continue because they are so effective, and it's not just about putting all your hopes on vendors and or on customers or clients to do the right thing. It's a conversation I think we need to have, and we need to keep adding layers. We need to keep upping the game. I do think, I got on my soapbox, I've done it before here, about network security and traditional networking, and I think that whole paradigm is irreparably broken. But the marriage of Edgewise, now ZWS, with the Zscaler or other technologies has really it's been great for me. It's been great for the company, but more importantly, it's been great to provide the kinds of solutions that we do for folks. And I think we're going to need more, not just from Zscaler, but across the board. I think we need more. We need to continue looking at how to keep flipping the page, keep adding different ways, and rethinking the ways we used to do things. I like the playing around with the TLS tunnels back in 2005, but I think we need to do even more now, and the technology lets us. So it's exciting times. It's depressing times. What is it? The best of times, the worst of times?
No, that's actually pretty accurate for this situation, Harry. Thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly this evening.
Again, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. Next time I want to do alcohol. I didn't this time because it just seemed weird with the snow outside. But
there you go. Hopefully you can come in studio next time, or at some point
much
next
better.
year, right? For folks that want to learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/edgewise. Or Zscaler, I think. Never mind.